Hey folks, I really want to talk about a Marvel superhero story from 1975, which was told in Defenders number 22 through 25. It's hard to overstate just how fascinated I am by this old story that's about a superhero team, but it's also about gentrification and white supremacy and a bunch of really big stuff. So I thought I'd dig into it some for this video. I've been working off and on to make a much longer video about the Defenders for a few years now, but I thought it'd be fun to do some shorter videos about individual comic arcs I find meaningful or thought-provoking, so that's what I'm going to do here.
But first, a word from our sponsor.
No, I'm kidding. I have 4 subscribers. First, some background on the Defenders, their creators, and the writer of this particular story.
The Defenders are a weird superhero team, and that's by design. The team's roster is pretty free-flowing, but it's most commonly associated with Doctor Strange, the Hulk, Namor the Submariner, and the Silver Surfer, along with a few D-listers like Nighthawk, Valkyrie, Hellcat, Gargoyle, Devil Slayer, and Cloud. There was a dark time a few years back when Netflix decided to use the name for a mediocre show about an entirely different superhero team, and the comics unfortunately followed suit. But thankfully, the Defenders have mostly bounced back from that, and have even gotten some new comic runs recently.
The Defenders were created by Roy Thomas in Marvel Feature number 1 back in 1971, and at the time the team was Doctor Strange, the Hulk, and Namor. In 1972, the team got its own ongoing series with Steve Englehart writing, and Len Wein took over the book in 1974 with Defenders number 12. Englehart was the one who added Silver Surfer and Valkyrie to the team, while Wein added Nighthawk. Interestingly, most of the characters who joined the team, either permanently or temporarily throughout the original run, were created by Roy Thomas, the guy who made the team. He created mainstays like Valkyrie, Nighthawk, and Red Guardian, along with visiting team members like Luke Cage, Damon Hellstrom, and Black Knight,
who you may know as Kit Harington in that one movie I never got around to watching.
Anyway, in 1975, with issue number 20, Steve Gerber took over as the writer for the Defenders.
Gerber is one of my favorite comic book writers, which I guess is obvious since I'm doing this whole video about one of his stories. His writing is delightfully weird and offbeat, as well as sharply satirical. Gerber used the weirdness of his writing as part of the satire. He would purposely incorporate very common comic book tropes in strange and unexpected ways, or avoid common comic book tropes in similarly strange ways to comment on the comic book medium and industry. Probably the most well-known example of this is Howard the Duck, a character Gerber created initially to comment on the prevalence of talking animal comics, trying to cash off the trend started by Donald Duck comics. Howard blew up in popularity and became something of a personal mouthpiece for Gerber for a few years.
But I'll talk more about Howard the Duck another day. Just you wait.
Gerber's 23-issue stint on Defenders gave them a reputation of being a weird, offbeat team, which has mostly continued into the present day.
His very first issue, Defenders number 20, told a story involving the Thing and a harmonica. And by the time he departed the book, the Defenders were instigating prison riots, fighting fascist clown self-help groups and whatever the fuck this is, and unwittingly running defense for a corporate cyborg's presidential run. And with stories like these that set the groundwork for other kooky Defenders stories later on, like that time they got lost in a Dr. Seuss world, or that time they Joker-fied a film professor, or that time groovy 1950s Nick Fury joined the team, or that time Nighthawk got robbed by a supervillain who kept shouting Marxist theory at him, or that time they all turned evil and defeated literally every other superhero team on the planet, or that time the Hulk went grocery shopping and exclusively purchased 100 cans of beans. I own that beans issue. It is my most prized possession.
Beans are good. Hulk loves beans.
He really likes beans.
But I keep coming back to the story Gerber wrote and Sal Buscema drew in Defenders 22 through 25. It's a little less wacky than some of his other works or some of the team's other adventures, but it's sharply satirical and evergreen in a way that few 1970s texts in any medium managed to be.
The problem with a nearly 5-decade-old story being so relevant, though, is that we can so easily apply its commentary to current events that we miss the original context for the satire entirely.
So, I'm going to tell you the story from start to finish because I love this story and I want to share it. For the most part, I'm going to trust you, dear viewers, to make all the contemporary connections all by yourself, as someone who's pretty smart and has a front row seat to these uncertain times. If you want to read the story for yourself before I ruin it by reading half the dialogue at you, the issues are available on Marvel's subscription service, Marvel Unlimited, which I honestly can't recommend highly enough. And once we're both familiar with the story, we'll go back through together and contextualize it by looking at historical events and other comics Gerber worked on at the time to get a sense of exactly what was on his mind while he wrote this. I think it'll be pretty fun and maybe even revealing. So, let's start.
We open on Valkyrie walking through a slum in Manhattan's Lower East Side at night. Some background information real quick.
Before she joined the Defenders, Valkyrie was introduced in Avengers number 83, 1970, and Incredible Hulk number 142, 1971, as a minor Norse villain associated with women's liberation. The covers of both issues feature Valkyrie defeating superheroes while accusing them of being male chauvinist pigs, and both issue stories are about Valkyrie leading women's uprisings against male superheroes. In Avengers, Valkyrie is literally longtime Thor villain, the Enchantress, in disguise, while in Incredible Hulk, the Enchantress temporarily transforms a wealthy young feminist protester into Valkyrie. While Marvel eventually retconned Valkyrie into Brunhilde of the Valkyrior, like in Thor Ragnarok or the more recent comics, the Valkyrie of Defenders at this time is a fabricated soul, newly created by the Enchantress and placed in another woman's comatose body. There's actually a subplot in this story about that comatose woman's ex-husband, but we're going to ignore it because it's mostly set up for another story down the road. And, you know, it's actually kind of in character to ignore Jack Norris. Enchantress is really big on misandry, so Valkyrie cannot fight women at all. Doing so causes her physical pain or weakens her for a time, depending on the story. Because her soul was only recently created, the Valkyrie of the 1970s and the 80s is often ignorant about the larger world, and for this reason she's used as the point of view character for most Defenders stories. So,
here we see the slum through Valkyrie's eyes as someone who hasn't really been to this kind of place before.
She wanders the streets of Lower Manhattan this chill January night, lost in thought, oblivious to her seeming surroundings, until the sound of her boot striking an empty whiskey bottle interrupts her brooding, and yet reinforces her sense of aloneness and despair. For all at once she becomes aware of the squalor looming over her, dwarfing her, engulfing her in its cold, grimy maw. But the essence of a slum is not to be found merely with the eye. Such a place has its own distinctive repertoire of aural stimuli, grunts, hisses, the clack of metal against metal.
Valkyrie comes upon a knife fight between two men and...
At first, Val does not understand. Neither of the two combatants seem at all anxious to talk, to settle their argument calmly, rationally. And then it dawns on her, how much have they truly to lose by killing or dying? The rents may be dear, but life is cheap down these dark streets.
Valkyrie intervenes in the fight, pissing off the combatants, so she goes superhero mode and conclusively ends the fight, scaring them off. Then she hears a scream from a nearby apartment building and charges in. A young mother is in the hallway, freaking out about her baby. Valkyrie runs into her apartment and...
She stops short, her face frozen with horror and disbelief. Baby has a cribmate, a rat fully the size of a cat, and spewing white, hot froth at the mouth.
Valkyrie dispatches the rat, but the young mother tells her that the apartment has plenty more. In disbelief, Valkyrie says,
"You haven't even any heat in this building. How can you live under such conditions?"
This angers the young mother, who is quick to point out that she can't afford better conditions, even with welfare, and finally, despairingly suggests,
"Maybe we should have let her die. It might have been better. Better for me, better for her."
Valkyrie is touched by this woman's despair and offers to help her find a solution. The mother laughs hopelessly.
"Solution? Give me a magical sword like yours, and I will show you the only solution."
But she comes along anyway. We cut to millionaire playboy Kyle Richmond at a fancy dress party in Manhattan's wealthy Upper East Side.
Kyle Richmond, the CEO of Richmond Enterprises, has super strength, but only at nighttime. He augments his power with wings and a jetpack to moonlight as the superhero Nighthawk. Nighthawk was introduced in 1969, nice, in Avengers number 69, nice, as part of a supervillain team, the Squadron Sinister, a pastiche of DC Comics superhero team, the Justice League. Nighthawk was the Squadron's version of Batman, which makes Kyle Richmond sort of Marvel's take on Bruce Wayne. After expressing a desire to stop villainy and become a superhero in Daredevil number 62, another issue by Roy Thomas, Nighthawk finally gave up his supervillain ways and joined the Defenders in Defenders number 13. Since then, he's been trying to use the good he does with the Defenders to make up for his past as a supervillain.
Tonight, Kyle is not feeling this party. His girlfriend, Trish Starr, lost her arm in a car bomb in giant-sized Defenders number 4, and he blames himself for it.
I plan to talk a lot more about Trish Starr and her subplot in a future video, but for now, Nighthawk feels guilty about being a former supervillain, he feels guilty about failing to protect his girlfriend, and he really, really needs something to go right for once.
But this is comics, so instead he gets approached by this sleazy real estate tycoon, Harold Holloman. Holloman has a business proposition for Kyle.
I've never met a rich man who didn't want to get richer, so I'm giving you a chance to jump in on the ground floor of something big. A new luxury high-rise project for the Lower East Side. That area's got no place to go but up, Kyle. Exciting,
But even though Kyle's the president of Richmond Enterprises, he doesn't really care about the company.
Mr. Holloman, I'm afraid I'm not in the mood to discuss business tonight. And I'm not well versed in the subject anyway. Pennyworth handles all my financial affairs. Call him in the morning. He'd know how exciting your project is. I couldn't care less.
Pennyworth, Kyle's financial advisor, is named after Bruce Wayne's butler, Alfred Pennyworth, which is a pretty cool little Easter egg.
This talk of business has Kyle even more down than he was before, so he ducks out of the party early and catches a taxi to Doctor Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum, where Wong, the Hulk, and Doctor Strange's off-and-on girlfriend Clea are attending the young mother and baby Valkyrie brought from the slums. We learn here that the young mother's name is Elena and that Hulk loves the baby,
which is so delightful and pure, and I love him so much.
Baby smiles makes Hulk happy.
Valkyrie tells Doctor Strange about her experiences in the Lower East Side.
I could not leave her in the horrid setting, yet others still dwell there in the same loathsome state.
This is your first experience with poverty, isn't it? I can sense the frustration you feel. It is not within even our power to solve the problem, Val, but we may take certain steps in this particular instance. The conditions in Elena's building are intolerable and illegal. In the morning, we shall find out the name of the landlord and phone the Board of Health.
I doubt that will impress Elena. She seems to put such little faith in such institutions.
Meanwhile, we're shown the white supremacist supervillain group, the Sons of the Serpent.
These guys were introduced in Avengers number 32 in 1966 in a story where they attacked foreign visitors and African Americans. It was actually the first appearance of Bill Foster, Lawrence Fishburne's character in the second Ant-Man movie. The Defenders story was actually only the Sons of the Serpent's third appearance ever.
In any case, the Sons of the Serpent attack the tenement building that Valkyrie and Elena had just left. As they launch a firebomb to burn the structure down, one of them shouts,
"As the first serpent drove Adam and Eve from Eden, so shall we drive from this land the unfit, the foreign-born, the inferior."
Read, the old, the infirm, the blind, the black, brown, yellow, and red of skin. Amos Ferret cannot see the flames, but he can hear them. His aged limbs are too stiff to allow him to run from the inferno that a moment ago was his home. But his lungs will still let him shout, so he cries out for help, once, twice, a third time, "Help!" Then the roar of the fire drowns out his voice. The heat of the blaze drives him back against a wall. Coarse, gray smoke fills his chest. He cries out one last time as the tongues of flame lick at his clothing and his body, and then he can cry no more.
The Defenders return to the building to pick up the baby's diapers and take note of the conditions there for Doctor Strange's report to the Board of Health. But when they arrive, they find...
Doc, look. The building. It's gone up in flames. Nothing left but a shell of brick.
Unlike poor Amos Ferret, most of the residents were able to safely evacuate and are now standing outside in shock, watching the fire department put out the fire and wondering how they'll be able to move on without their possessions. Then, who should arrive but...
Okay, who did it? When I find out which one of you was responsible for this...
Well, what do you know? Old Weird Harold himself. And it looks like I didn't misjudge him at all.
You know the man Nighthawk?
Do I have to admit it?
I don't think he was supposed to say that twice, but it's fine, don't worry about it. That's right. It turns out that new luxury high-rise project Holloman was trying to get Kyle Richmond to invest in would be built here, on top of this other building he already owned that already had folks living in it.
And now he's accusing those folks, who just lost everything they owned, of burning down his building themselves.
Don't deny it! One of you, or all of you, set this fire to get back at me!
He's belligerent enough in this that...
Don't you speak to me that way, you big ape! Take your filthy hands off me!
The black man does remove his hands, and as Holloman requested, he speaks not another word. But his eyes bulge, his brow furrows, he grits his teeth, the muscles and veins of his neck stand out in bold, pulsing relief as the wad of spittle trickles down his cheek. And when he can contain his rage no longer, he explodes.
Doc, they're angry enough to kill him. We've got to stop them.
The defenders intervene...
for their sake as well as his.
Knowing that lashing out violently, no matter how justifiable their reasons, will only end in misery for these people, who hold no power and have no institutional backing. Dr. Strange lifts Holloman above the crowd, while Nighthawk tries to talk the crowd down, but then the Sons of the Serpent return in full force.
Now, traitor, comes the hour of the Serpent, the time of judgment.
The Serpent Supreme, the team's leader, who wields a hilariously dinky staff, announces,
"We judge the white man innocent, while you, Birdman, have committed treason against your race. Tonight, the great white race begins its march to dominance once again. Tonight begins the return to the rule of the majority, with death the fate of any who oppose us. For 2 decades, this nation has felt the tyranny of the non-white minority. But no more. White and only white is beautiful."
The Hulk takes exception to this.
Only white? Hulk is not white.
Which isn't quite accurate, but, you know, good luck telling him that.
The Snake Men also hate Hulk. Snake Men are Hulk's enemies, and Hulk will smash them.
And all hell breaks loose as Hulk attacks the Serpents and Valkyrie, Nighthawk, and the newly homeless tenants jump into the brawl. Doctor Strange breaks up the fight as best he can, and the Serpent Supreme orders a hasty
Doctor Strange breaks up the fight the best he can, and the Serpent Supreme orders a hasty retreat, promising that
"We shall return in force, and you shall be made to regret your choice to stand beside these vermin."
And that's Defenders number 22.
In number 23, a few Sons of the Serpent have been sent to track the Defenders to their headquarters, so the villains can launch a surprise attack. But the scouting party gets surprised themselves by Hank Pym, currently going by Yellow Jacket.
Hank was a major player in that original Avengers story that introduced the Sons of the Serpent, so this is a bit of a revenge tour for him.
Hank dispatches with the villains pretty quickly, and he figures they might have something to do with the Defenders, so he takes one prisoner and brings him to the Sanctum Sanctorum for answers.
Hank worked with the Defenders briefly in Giant-Sized Defenders number 4 when Nighthawk's girlfriend lost her arm in that car accident, so he already has a rapport with the team.
In the Sanctum, the team is recovering from their fight, and Hulk is back to doting on that baby.
I love him so much.
Nice baby. Baby give big smile for Hulk and Bugman.
Nighthawk channels his inner Batman parody to interrogate the henchman that Yellow Jacket caught.
Talk. Who runs your little playgroup? Who pays for the costumes and guns? How many of you are there? What do you really want? Answer me.
Enemy!
The guy's actually pretty forthcoming, if a bit, angry and ranty.
"We're an army, a great white army. with battalions coast to coast in every major city. There are thousands of us. Thousands! And nobody can stop our march. Not you, not the Avengers, not the police, not anybody. You'll see at midnight, on television, when the whole nation sees. You'll see our leader will speak.
So the team turns on Doctor Strange's TV.
Oh, sorry, I meant Cyclopean Tube.
And
tonight's guest host and his interviewee vanish precisely at midnight, to be replaced on the screen by the piercing eyes and gaping maw of a cobra. A calm, evenly modulated, dignified voice announces,
"Ladies and gentlemen, the Serpent Supreme of the United States."
And the picture changes again.
My fellow Americans,
The Serpent Supreme begins.
I come before you at a time when our nation stands at the crossroads of its destiny.
The effect is disconcerting. His voice, calm, assured, reasonable in tone, belies his fanatic's garb. For a moment, Nighthawk seems to sense a friendly familiarity about it, and then realizes it must be the words, not the voice. He's heard them before from senators, congressmen, presidents, and they are as comfortingly vacuous as ever. The Serpent Supreme continues,
Our United States are plagued tonight by enemies which cannot be seen, cannot be touched, but which touch our lives in very visible ways. Inflation, unemployment, recession. The average American is shocked by the high cost of food and gasoline. He lives in fear of losing his job. He's afraid to save his money and afraid to spend it. And he is asked to cut back while the government lavishes billions of dollars annually on those who are too lazy to work. Malcontents who think this nation owes them a living. Persons who by their very presence in this nation threaten the well-being of the majority. The white majority. Who are these parasites who would steal the bread and butter from the mouths of white children? Who would take your job away from you? You know them. They're the neighbors you prayed you'd never have. They're black, red, brown, or yellow of skin. They worship at something called a synagogue instead of an American church. They speak behind your back in a foreign tongue. They are the so-called minorities who rule our nation like tyrants and dictators because our Congress and our courts and the media haven't the courage to refuse them a favor. We intend to drive these leeches into the seas and rivers, or drown them in their own blood, if need be. And we call upon every good American, every member of the oppressed white race, to join us. Tonight heralds the coming of the sons of the serpent, no longer the naive tool of ambitious politicians or media magnates, but a nationwide army of common men, white men like yourselves, who stand pledged to wipe out a menace that grows like a cancer in the heart of this great land. As the first serpent drove Adam and Eve from Eden, so shall we drive from this land the unfit, the foreign-born, the inferior. We begin, even now in New York. We ask you to stand beside us when our crusade reaches your town. Thank you, and good morning.
The image fades, and the defenders and their guests gaze speechless and horrified on the now black screen.
He didn't miss a trick.
Yellow Jacket mutters.
The only scare word he left out was communist.
He didn't need that one.
Nighthawk grumbles.
We just signed a treaty with them.
I wasn't aware such irrational hatreds existed among different body types, Stephen. Will anyone believe his rantings?
Queries Val, and Doctor Strange grimly nods.
I love this page. It's the first time I saw prose in a comic, and the words themselves sit with me for a while every time I read them.
Gerber did prose pages for a number of comics. He often expressed that Marvel's 17-page limit was too constraining for him, so he would use prose to circumvent that limit. Here, though, the prose really makes this comic more memorable and gives it more staying power. It's impactful. Doctor Strange switches off the television.
They fully intend to tear the nation asunder, and times are perilous enough for frustrations deep enough as to make their success almost conceivable. So the question becomes, what are we to do?
Nighthawk realizes that they were probably funded by Holloman, but before the defenders can act on that revelation, the house shakes from a nearby explosion and they rush outside to see.
A firebomb!
Yellowjacket shouts.
If it was dropped by plane, half of Lower Manhattan could be in flames.
The team splits up, with Yellowjacket and the Hulk heading south to do what they can about the fire, and Doctor Strange, Nighthawk, and Valkyrie leaving to confront Holloman and learn what he really knows. Yellowjacket manages to save some children caught in the rubble, while Hulk puts out the fire with a method that
would not work in real life, but hey, it looks really cool.
Unfortunately, Yellowjacket is caught in the shockwave and sprains his ankle, which leaves him open to capture. We cut to
the Long Island estate of Harold Holloman, a chillingly quiet contrast to the pandemonium that reigns in the city. Save for 2 servants, both off for the night, Harold Holloman dwells alone in this suburban palace of white granite. 18 rooms, all to himself.
How many of the former tenants of his recently burnt building could have received shelter in an 18-room house, do you think?
Doctor Strange and Nighthawk threaten and interrogate Holloman.
The tenement burning solved a lot of problems for you, didn't it? Saved you some money. No need to fix the boiler or paint the place, if you knew it'd be destroyed.
All right, I admit it. I'm glad it happened, but I swear I didn't know. I've nothing to do with the Sons of the Serpent.
Doctor Strange believes Holloman is telling the truth, which means the group's benefactor is still at large. The defenders return to the scene of the firebombing, defeated, and just like Yellowjacket, they're overpowered and captured by the Sons of the Serpent. Even though it takes 2 of Gerber's precious 17 pages, the Sons of the Serpent even managed to take down the Hulk.
But we cannot afford to waste precious seconds gloating over this minor victory.
That minor victory being knocking out the fucking Hulk.
We'll deliver the 3 white traitors to our headquarters, then resume our part of the mission.
And as the Sons of the Serpent leave the Hulk behind because he's much too heavy to carry, issue number 23 ends with our heroes in a pretty dire situation. Besides Doctor Strange, who's still out cold, the Defenders wake up at the beginning of issue number 24 in the jaws of the Serpent. The Serpent Supreme has determined that they will publicly execute these 4 white traitors as an example to anybody else who might stand up to them. But first he delivers a supervillain monologue explaining why his group is firebombing Manhattan's slums.
Our mighty race itself shall be the agent of this nation's purification. We shall simply make that uprising inevitable by putting the torch to every ghetto and barrio in every major city across the United States, forcing the non-white vermin to abandon the urban blight which their own sloth brought into being. We shall create a nation of refugee poor within the United States. Homeless, penniless, they will troop out of the cities in seemingly endless black, brown, and yellow-skinned columns, slouching toward the only possible shelter, the suburbs, where white men herded their families decades ago to escape these very animals. The whites will have a choice, then. Accept the refugees into their homes or slay them. For a time, the suburbs will be a battleground. Many people will die along with the scum, but there can be only one outcome. We have the numbers, after all.
Valkyrie, who you may remember has only just tonight learned that racism even exists, is shocked.
You would cause such turmoil, expend such effort, toil with so many lives, merely to eliminate persons whose only offense was to be born with a skin darker than yours?
It does seem incredible, doesn't it? That they could funnel so much energy into something so petty.
Val breaks free of her bonds and wrecks shit, tearing through the serpents until...
You are a woman? But I am forbidden to harm another woman. The enchantress magic.
And the villains manage to take her out.
Now, aren't you glad our charter was amended to admit daughters of the serpent as well?
Gas boss, gatelight, girl keep, I guess. The Hulk has reverted to Bruce Banner and made his way back to the Sanctum Sanctorum. He asks Clea to use Doctor Strange's crystal ball to magically contact all the heroes the Defenders have worked with in the past so they can lend their support.
She manages to contact 2, Damon Hellstrom, the son of Satan, and Daredevil, the son of a boxer, which doesn't quite come with the same bragging rights.
Clea passes out from the effort of just reaching those two, so Bruce uses another one of Doctor Strange's mystical devices, his telephone, to contact Luke Cage, Power Man.
Fun fact, this issue is actually the first time Daredevil and Luke Cage ever met. Defenders?
In the Sons of the Serpent headquarters, Yellow Jacket uses his pin particles to shrink and escape capture. He can't free Nighthawk, and Doctor Strange is still out cold, so Hank sets out on his own to leave the building and seek help. But as he hobbles through the empty facility,
his eyes widen, his jaw drops at the sight of a foot-thick window of glass looking out at the floor of the Atlantic Ocean.
wow, sure could use a submariner right about now. Some kind of ruler of the deep. Any moment now.
Meanwhile, back at the Sanctum Sanctorum,
Damon Hellstrom and Luke Cage try differing methods to get the base's location out of the henchman Yellow Jacket captured in the last issue. But then Elena runs in.
Dr. Banner! Clea, come quickly! It's Valkyrie on television! They're going to kill her!
And on the TV they see
Eyes of Ashtur!
By the Hadean chimes!
Great Scott! Sweet sister!
For all their faults, you gotta give them this. The Sons of the Serpent do have a sense of drama.
the sight of Valkyrie tied to an inverted cross and about to be set aflame by a bunch of cheering white supremacists is so infuriating that Bruce Banner immediately transforms into the Hulk and charges out of the house to take them on.
An instant later, they're gone. Daredevil carried away on his Billy Club's steel cable. The Hulk catapulted into the sky by the mightiest leg muscles on Earth. The son of Satan at the reins of his fiery chariot, with a still disbelieving Power Man hanging on for dear life as the team of Hellspawn pulls it aloft.
And the team up immediately falls apart.
Damon and Luke Cage get sucked up by a wormhole, Daredevil gets knocked unconscious, and the Hulk gets
blinded by a light pistol or something.
While Valkyrie's cross has been set alight. Things are looking even worse for our heroes at the end of issue number 24 than they did at the end of the last issue,
which is pretty much how comics works.
We learn at the beginning of issue 25 that Clea was responsible for the wormhole that sucked up Damon Hellstrom and Luke Cage. She was able to track down Doctor Strange through his Eye of Agamotto and redirected Damon and Luke to his location so they can help break him out of the Sons of the Serpent's base. Luke and Damon are easily able to break Doctor Strange and Nighthawk from their shackles. While Yellow Jacket had been unable to find any tunnels out of their prison, Damon is able to use,
like, hell magic or something
to find the exit, and the team escapes.
But while hope blazes anew for the ex-captives, their allies' situation grows ever more desperate on the night-darkened New York streets above. Valkyrie, unconscious, bound to an inverted cross, a pile of inflamed rubble at her head. Daredevil, about to join her. The Hulk, blinded, uncomprehending, lashing out aimlessly in unreasoning fear and frustration.
Right as things are at their most grim, however, that ex-husband I said I was ignoring shows up and tackles the henchman holding the torch.
And his action touches a nerve in the citizens massed along the sidewalk. For what they see is not a ex-husband driven to protect his ex-wife, but simply a man like themselves with no special powers who is willing to defy the serpent's brutality. And if he can do it...
Yeah, I'm not reading that. You can read it for yourselves. The white people of New York decide to fight back.
You mess with one of us, you mess with all of us!
The tide of history has crested upon a reef of humanity, and the people, it would seem, have caused it to ebb. Nifty metaphor, no? Steve Gerber.
The Sons of the Serpent can't handle this new mob along with the superheroes, and they finally realize they have to run.
Sons of the Serpent, regroup! Return to home base! The fools don't realize we want to save the white race. Release our people from their servitude to the so-called oppressed minorities. But they'll learn. When the Puerto Ricans steal their jobs, when the blacks steal their daughters, they'll learn! But for now, we must retreat!
Back in the Sons of the Serpent's base, the remaining defenders have found an escape hatch.
One by one, the defenders emerge from the hatch into an office, plush, but otherwise indistinguishable from 10,000 others like it in Manhattan. Indeed, the setting is so ordinary that several moments pass before the truth dawns upon...
I think I know this place. I've been here.
But his tongue halts mid-sentence, and he utters not another word as his gaze falls upon a certain letterhead.
It's true. This is Pennyworth's office. And my money has been funding the Sons of the Serpent.
Furious, Nighthawk bursts into Pennyworth's home like a Batman out of hell, shouting,
"How could you do it? How? This is who I am, and you almost killed me. You and your Sons of the Serpent."
Mr. Richmond! Oh, dear Lord, I didn't know.
Forget me. I don't even matter. But how could you do what you did to your own people?
Pennyworth, Kyle Richmond's financial advisor who runs Richmond Enterprises in Kyle's place, was the one who funded the Sons of the Serpent. And he's black.
Is every white man your brother? Do you feel kinship with him because your skins are the same color? Of course you don't. Why should you? And why should I?
But I don't go out and murder people because they're white either.
Ah, but you hold stock in companies which gouge the public of millions each year, and in firms that pollute the air and water, and in... What need I go on, sir? You never objected to those investments, never even asked where the money was. On that basis, I assumed...
That I wouldn't object to plunging the nation into civil war?
Yes, sir. If it would help increase your fortune.
You did it all out of your loyalty to me, huh? For some financial reason I'll probably never understand.
Nighthawk drags his financial advisor to the Sanctum Sanctorum, where Luke Cage beats the shit out of him, which is pretty cathartic to watch.
Killing him won't serve any purpose. He's not dangerous anymore. But the others are. They're still armed, able to strike again. And they will, if we don't move against them now.
Yeah, alright. Let's get this over with.
The team smashes their way into the Serpent's base and trashes the villains, but stopping the Sons of the Serpent doesn't make Nighthawk feel any better.
Don't you see? I'm to blame for all of this. Me and my lack of responsibility. If only I'd watched where my money was going. But no, I couldn't be bothered. I was always too busy doing nothing, and now...
Funny, ain't it? How you figure a rich dude like him ain't got nothing to sweat, and then...
Material wealth may liberate a man from some concerns, my friend, but never from all. Not if the man also possesses that quality called conscience.
And this has been Justin with a Beard Theater's production of That One Defender story I want to talk about. Thank you. Thank you. You're too kind. Thank you. So, let's move back to the beginning and dig into this story a bit.
But first, some caveats. I've been praising this story quite a lot, and I'll continue to do so, but it's worth acknowledging that it is definitely flawed. It's got a few obvious lettering errors. It's very much a white savior story. The artwork and dialogue can get caricatured at times, and I partly glossed over the Jack Norris stuff because having a whole subplot where a man keeps telling his ex-wife what she should be doing and then gets a hero moment at the end feels pretty insidiously sexist. Some of these problems are definitely because they were written by a white man 40 years ago, but some of them are probably also the result of the tight release schedule of writing comics for Marvel. Gerber was infamous for missing deadlines, to a point that he was pushed out of the company for it, and possibly for some other reasons, but I won't get into my pointless conspiracy theories just now. I imagine at the very least some of the pacing mistakes would have been fixed if the scheduling wasn't so tight, but it could also be that with the benefit of more editing time, the creators could have noticed and amended some of those issues of racism and sexism as well. But that's the nature of reading old stories. You have to take the good with the bad, and I hope it's become clear that there's definitely a lot of good here as well.
What's interesting right off the bat is the way Steve Gerber frames life and poverty as driving people to embrace death. Violent crime is portrayed here as almost nihilistic, born out of a disregard for one's own life in the face of inescapable poverty. When Valkyrie comes upon the knife fight at the beginning of the issue, she realizes that they fight because how much have they truly to lose by killing or dying? The rents may be dear, but life is cheap down these dark streets. While the men in the knife fight are non-white and speak with caricatured dialects, this root of their violence, the disregard for one's own life, is not framed as racialized. Elena appears to be white, and she says the same thing, that maybe we should have let the baby die, it might have been better. Also interesting is the way Gerber uses Valkyrie as a perspective character here. Here in the opening, Valkyrie's whiteness but lack of knowledge of the existence of race allows the residents of the slum to racialize her while she does not have the socialization to do so in return, which turns the lens of racialization back on white readers to an extent. In that prose passage, Valkyrie says, "I was unaware such irrational hatreds existed among differing body types," and she's still coming to terms with the existence of race while prisoner in the Sons of the Serpent base. The residents she meets react directly to her whiteness. The black knife fighter calls her White Lady, the Puerto Rican knife fighter calls her Blanca, and even Elena places the blame for inflation and welfare on her seemingly entirely because of her outward appearance, saying,
"My rent is $150 a month. That is what your welfare says my baby and I can live on. I eat dog food so she can have milk. Your inflation, your welfare."
I am sorry. I did not mean.
Your kind never does. You talk and you study and you talk some more, but you never mean anything.
Steve Gerber actually had another story about a very different Viking character that was published concurrently with this one in Man-Thing numbers 16 through 18.
In these issues, a hyper-individualist anti-union longshoreman named Josephson dresses as a Viking warrior and goes on a murderous rampage from San Francisco to the Florida Everglades, killing any men he judges as not being manly enough.
Sissy dies, man lives, and this axe here will carve a world for real men to live in again.
After losing a fight with Man-Thing, Josephson wanders as a wanted fugitive for a time, but he's fully embraced by the small town of Citrusville when he expresses support for the advocacy group Mothers March for Decency, who want to censor the subjects taught in their local schools. The leader of the group shouts,
"Communism, atheism, sex. Is that what we want our children taught? If we're to control what our children think, we have to decide what they learn."
and Josephson agrees, adding,
"There are no men anymore, only sissies, 'cause the stinking schools and the stinking music made 'em that way. I only killed what you had no courage to kill."
The subsequent violence and book burning is a direct reference to the 1974 textbook war in Kanawha County, West Virginia, a fundamentalist conservative anti-textbook movement that sought to ban books that taught about sex education, communism, black history, and other subjects they believed their children should not know about. As Adam Lotz describes it in his book, The Other School Reformers, Conservative Activism in American Education,
in the school controversy that engulfed Kanawha County, West Virginia in 1974, shootings, bombings, and violence became nearly daily occurrences. School Superintendent Kenneth Underwood himself eventually had to fight off a physical attack at a school board meeting. He was also arrested by conservative local politicians and charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor. His crime? Approving textbooks that included the work of writers such as Eldridge Cleaver, Sigmund Freud, and E. Cummings. Protesters blocked school buses, and mysterious assailants shot holes through schools, buses, and police cars. Dynamite bombs rocked the offices of the school board building. Protesters continued to shoot at empty school buses. School buildings became, in some cases, empty shells, blocked by angry pickets on protesters.
In January of 1975, right around the release of this Man-Thing arc, the Ku Klux Klan themselves tried to get involved in this protest, and as Lotz put it,
for many racial liberals,
presumably Gerber included,
the support of Klan leaders for the textbook protest signaled the essential racism at the heart of the entire textbook protest.
Which was, a pretty fair assessment, considering that protest chants and signs often included the N slur. I interpret Josephson dressing as a Viking as a statement on racialist Odinism, which you may recognize as a thing neo-Nazis do, where they use Norse mythology imagery like runes and pretend they're hearkening back to some glorious white past. This trend really took hold in the American far right in the 1970s, and it even led to the formation of such current Nazi staples as the 14 words, the 88 precepts. If you want to learn more about the rise of racialist Odinism, there's a pretty good chapter about it in Damon T. Barry's book, Blood and Faith, Christianity and American White Nationalism. With this in mind, the Mothers March for Decency's willingness to team up with this random serial killer dressed as a Viking as long as it serves their ends reads as a statement on the hypocrisy of Christian fundamentalists' willingness to align with white nationalists at a time when white nationalists were embracing paganism. Moving back to Defenders, there's also a clear contrast being drawn here between Josephson and Valkyrie, or these new fake racist Odinists, and the real thing. While Josephson appropriates a Viking outfit to fight to restore imagined hierarchies of the past, Valkyrie is an actual blonde, blue-eyed Odinist, and not only is she here fighting against white nationalists, but she doesn't even know what race is. My sister's a historian, and she and I spent several days poring through old arson and firebombing reports, trying to figure out if this story was referring to a specific real-world case of racially motivated arson, and our search took us a lot deeper than I'd expected it to.
In 1975, Steve Gerber was the editor of a humor magazine called Crazy, which was Marvel's mostly failed attempt to compete with magazines like Mad and Cracked.
I read through everything Gerber did for Marvel to get a sense of what he was thinking about at the time, but I'd mostly written Crazy off because it's hard to find and he was only the editor, so he didn't write every segment. But I managed to track it down and force myself to read through the dated jokes so I didn't miss anything. And in issue number 11, which is the same cover date as Defenders number 24, I found this.
Crazy's Far Out Fumetti number 5. In A Little Shantytown.
My name's Michael Jackson. I'm 26 years old, and I write advertising copy for a small agency in the city. Oh yeah, I'm black. Normally I wouldn't even press that fact. I mean, it's kind of obvious once you see me. But it's important that you're aware that I'm black. You'll see why in a few minutes. The first Jackson, only he didn't have that name then, came over to the U.S. on a slave ship back in 1843. He came with his 3 brothers and 2 sisters. Only 2 of them survived their trip to Alabama. My great-great-great-granddad worked in the fields for a dude named Smith. According to some, he was straight with the slaves. His wife buried him right after Granddad fell over and died from exhaustion and excessive beatings. After President Lincoln freed us all, my great-great-granddad Alfie Jackson and his wife Maddie moved up north to Birmingham. Maddie dug Alfie's grave all by herself after a couple of ex-graycoats spotted him plowing in the fields whistling like a bird. Great-grandfather Ezra and his wife Enid May decided to stay on their parents' farm and try to make something of it. My grandfather buried his parents right after the Ku Klux Klan tied him to crosses and burned him to an ash. Grandfather Cahill moved to Mississippi. He got a job in the local gunsmith shop. A couple of weeks later, some of the local farmers got riled up on account of him. Seems they didn't want a black man working on their guns. I hear my grandmother didn't stop crying until she died. A few years later, she died in an alleyway, clutching her kids to her breast to keep them warm. My dad enlisted in the army during the Second World War. He was sent overseas with an all-white battalion. His fellow GIs didn't much care for him. They beat him up, fed him his own waste products, almost crippled him. For years afterward, he screamed out at night. I was a war baby, born in '48. My parents swore that I would be the first Jackson to really make it big. They scrimped and saved for years. You see, they wanted to get out of the South and leave all that hatred and prejudice behind. 2 years ago, we bought a house in the suburbs of Boston, and my dad got a job in an engineering firm. Money was fine. Our neighbors were nice. They smiled at us, talked to us like we were equals. We were set, man. Last week, they firebombed us in the middle of the night. Mom, Dad, I hope you don't mind, but I'm moving back to Alabama tonight. At least there, you know who your enemies are.
This 2-page photo comic credits Marv Wolfman of Teen Titans and Crisis on Infinite Earths fame as the writer, Michelle Wolfman, Marv's wife at the time and colorist on series like Howard the Duck and Amazing Spider-Man, as the photographer, and Alex Simmons, writer of a number of Archie comics and the Batman miniseries Orpheus Rising, as well as the founder of Kids Comic Con, as the model. Even though Gerber didn't write it, I felt like the racially motivated firebombings in a Boston suburb mentioned here had to be connected to the firebombings in Defenders. So I emailed Mr. Wolfman and Mr. Simmons to see if either of them could remember what event the comic was about. Marv Wolfman responded first, and he said,
I know my name is listed as writer, but I have absolutely no memory of this piece at all. Frankly, I doubt I wrote it. Also, once I left as editor and Steve took over, started working from home, and wouldn't know what Steve wrote or why he chose to tell this story in Crazy as well as in Defenders. I think he must have written it, and the production department pasted on the wrong credits.
That got me no closer to learning what it was about, but it opened the intriguing possibility that Steve Gerber might have written this himself. Mr. Simmons didn't remember the exact event that inspired it either. He said,
I'm sorry to say that I don't recall this referring to a specific bombing incident in Boston, but I'm even sorry to say that at the time there were a number of incidents that could have inspired this story. The late 60s through mid to late 70s were a challenging time for that generation. I know every generation has its challenges, but I think that the 60s and 70s were particularly difficult for the United States. Not only were we questioning race relationships at that time and challenging racism and sexism, we were challenging a lot of the concepts of the American dream. The 40s and 50s were fading, and the 60s had become the reality. And the reality was that war wasn't always just. Patriotism has its price, but some folks weren't willing to pay it for justifiable reasons. What was even crazier were there were people who were willing to die for their country and yet were being manipulated into a war that many felt was unjust. I felt like both sides lost something. Either way, with a lot of what the country had been built on for generations being questioned and challenged, it brought out a lot of hostility on both sides, and lives were lost. This story was just one small chronicle of a mindset and experience of the times.
And Mr. Simmons was right. Once I stopped trying to look for a singular instance that could align with this, and instead looked at the bigger picture,
I realized that we couldn't find a singular instance because there were simply too many arson cases at the time across the United States, alongside a much larger wave of general racially motivated violence in the country. Let me show you what I mean by starting just in Boston, where that Shantytown photo comic was set.
In September of 1974, the city of Boston implemented a busing system for desegregating their schools, and as Jack Tager, author of Boston Riots, 3 Centuries of Social Violence, put it,
what followed from September 1974 to the fall of 1976 was the outpouring of staggering violence, almost daily and continuous for 3 years.
This included firebombings, riots, random beatings of passers-by, bricks and rocks thrown, all racially motivated and constant for 3 years. I couldn't find an exact incident because whatever it was just a drop in the bucket. In fact, the Boston busing riots parallel this story in more ways than simply both having firebombs. You might remember that the Serpent Supreme plans to drive non-white refugees into the suburbs, assuming that white suburban residents will wage open war against the invasion. Well, Boston's busing controversy was also the source of the first ever major political divide within Irish-American Bostonians. Those who lived in the poorer neighborhoods affected by busing were against it, while those who lived in the untouched suburbs were for it. Many of the protesters believed that if the middle-class neighborhoods were also integrated, the residents there would stop supporting integration, and there's some evidence that's true. One of the 4 neighborhoods with the most violence, Charlestown, wasn't included in the first phase of busing and was also entirely peaceful for the first year of riots. After the first year, though, busing legislation was expanded to include Charlestown, and then they too blew up with racist violence. Arson was also rampant nationwide for the entirety of the 1970s. I found a 1983 article by James Brady, the director of Boston's arson strike force at the time, in which he expressed the enormity of this wave of arson by saying that just New York City's South Bronx district was hit with over 30,000 arson cases from 1970 to 1979. That's over 8 arson cases a day for 10 years in one district. This wave was nationwide. This article said that most arson cases went entirely unsolved because they happened in ghettos. And the assumption was that arsonists are all deviants, people who live in ghettos are all deviants, therefore it's one of them, case closed. But when Brady ran the numbers, he found that arson was more common in buildings owned by absentee landlords than in owner-occupied tenements in the same neighborhoods, that arson was rare in public housing projects, and that most of the cases used accelerants and ignition devices that were expensive and hard to acquire, which implies that most of these cases were probably the result of insurance schemes. In June of 1975, for instance, the New York Times reported that 4 cases of insurance fraud by arson were being indicted, including one case from April where a real estate mogul, Imre Oberlander, and an accomplice
had blackened their faces, and Mr. Oberlander was wearing a wig when they were picked up a few blocks from his Bronx buildings with 2 firebombs in their car.
Oberlander had already collected $125,000 in 21 fire insurance claims in the last 5 years, which is something like $650,000 in 2022 money. And the district attorney at the time said that these 4 indictments were a drop in the bucket because there had been over 5,500 arson cases in South Bronx in the last 17 months. So yeah, maybe in the Defender's story, Harold Holloman hadn't set his building on fire himself, but there were hundreds of real-world Hollamans who did. And just like Oberlander, he immediately tried to pin the blame on his own black tenants. Kyle Richmond, on the other hand, is invested in plans to redevelop the tenements and funded the Sons of the Serpent's firebombings not in support of their racist motives, but to profit off that investment. In the same way, many of these real-world insurance fraud cases weren't outright racially motivated, but their impact on minorities and use of racist stereotypes to avoid blame led to outcomes nearly indistinguishable from those of racially motivated firebombings. I think the use of Pennyworth as a villain in the story really makes this point hit home. He obviously didn't want to do a genocide or have an ethno-state, and Kyle wasn't racist either. He spent the whole comic furiously trying to track down who was funding the Sons of the Serpent because he was so upset by the attacks. But they funded the racist attacks after all, not for any personal vindictiveness or prejudice, but because it would make them money. I really like Gerber's use of Pennyworth in this story. Like I said before, Nighthawk was created as a pastiche of DC superhero Batman, and Pennyworth is named after Bruce Wayne's butler and parental figure, Alfred Pennyworth. Framing Alfred as a villainous figure is already a subversive move, but Defenders took it a step further by dressing Pennyworth in a purple smoking jacket with green pants, the colors of many classic comic book supervillains, including the Joker. In this way, Gerber frames millionaire Kyle Richmond's support system as superhero Nighthawk's greatest enemy. Unlike the random anarchic violence of the Joker, Pennyworth's violence is systemic, motivated, and highly beneficial to Kyle Richmond's portfolio. This arc opens with exactly the sort of situation Batman dealt with in Detective Comics at the time, a nighttime knife fight between 2 racialized men in a poor neighborhood. But instead of stopping there, it traces the structural reasons that led to the knife fight, and at the top it finds Bruce Wayne, Batman himself. With this story, Steve Gerber used the traditional superhero comic book format to question whether traditional superhero comics fundamentally misrepresent the root causes of the crimes and villains that superheroes claim to stop, and I think that's really clever. I want to end this by looking back to the ancient year of 2015. God, I barely remembered it at this point, but between all those things, I can't remember. Marvel released the comic Captain America Sam Wilson #1, and Fox News had a meltdown.
Here you have Marvel doing a little bit of a PR stunt. In fact, they've made Sam Wilson, who was formerly the Falcon. He's an African American. He's taking over as Captain America now, but he's got a new odd enemy. Instead of going against Hydra and the typical Captain America villains, he's going up against conservatives. That's his new enemy.
And here's a quote from the book of the series. Attention, all trespassers. I am the supreme serpent. By invading this sovereign land, you defy the laws of God, nature, and the United States Constitution. Therefore, I hereby apprehend you by the power vested in me by the aforementioned God, nature, etc., etc.
So who is this serpent? Is this serpent an Islamic extremism, an ISIS member bent on destroying Western civilization? No. The serpent is an American who has misgivings about unlimited illegal immigration and the costs associated with it.
Right.
And that, according to the comic book, is evil.
What about back in the day when these comic books, Captain America used to be punching Hitler in the face?
Yeah.
That was the front page of a Captain America comic book back during World War II.
And now the threat comes from ordinary Americans. Probably some of you watching at home. They think you're dangerous.
Keep politics out of comic books. That's what I say.
Yes, that's Tucker Carlson, the world's most popular conspiracy theorist and heir to the Swanson frozen food empire, whining about how unfairly Marvel is treating the Sons of the Serpent, who you might recognize as not nearly as unprecedented as those journalists are making them out to be. If you want to learn more about that story and where it ended up, I'd recommend checking out YouTuber Jose's video, Why Secret Empire Was Great. But here, I want to talk about the response to this Fox News report for a minute, because a whole lot of outlets had a whole lot of fun laughing about how the Sons of the Serpent aren't new, they've been around since the 60s, but none of them mentioned this highly relevant and thought-provoking Defender story, which again, was only the villain's third appearance ever, and I think that's a shame. We're still stuck in this continued strategy of combating far-right fake outrage at wokeness in comics by just pointing out that old comics were also political. But this strategy isn't all that useful for countering these culture war outrage narratives. We live in a cultural moment that's lousy with superheroes, and while I'm as happy as a pig in mud, I know that some folks are getting tired of just how much superheroes have seeped into literally everything. But it means that on top of this story being politically relevant, more people are in a position to understand and appreciate it now than ever before because of familiarity with the characters, the tropes, and the general storytelling style. And that's true across the board for all these old stories, which are more often than not very political. And even though, just like with this Defender story, old political comics are talking about issues in their own time, they're also very applicable to the current day. And why aren't we taking more advantage of that? We should be bringing back these old stories, not just as relics of the past or fun comics where the good guy beats up the bad guy, though they are also both of those things, but as opportunities to connect the past to the present, to make connections between problems we were dealing with then and those same problems we're dealing with now, and to help more people to understand that nothing is new.
Thanks for watching, and I hope you got something out of this video. I plan to do more videos like this about comics and more videos about other things as well. Video games, novels, poems, who knows? The possibilities are endless. I hope you stick around and see where this channel goes. Bye.